Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, and experience of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Lotte Jensen. Lotte, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Lotte, allow me to introduce you. Actually, I should be calling you Professor Lotte Jensen because you are a professor in the history of Dutch literature and culture, a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Science, and you're currently working on a project, Heritage of Hunger. You're also a columnist with the Dutch national newspaper. And in my preparation, I saw you have a very long list of additional activities where a number involve being on boards of advice or being a member of a jury. And one thing which stuck out for me, which I found interesting, was you also are the jury chair of the Inkspot Prize, which is for the best Dutch political cartoon. Last but not least, although your history in Dutch literature and culture, you're born in Denmark. And again, welcome to the program. And I would like to start off with that last fact about you. How does someone born in Denmark end up being a professor of history of Dutch literature and culture?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a very nice question, of course, and I get this question very often. Well, actually, we moved to the Netherlands when I was a very, very young girl. So I only was 1 year old, but I learned to speak Dutch when I was 4 years old. So that makes me a second learner of Dutch. It's not my first language. But I developed a huge interest in Dutch history, Dutch literature, Dutch culture, and especially the issue that I am not a Dutch by birth. That gives me an advantage when I write about Dutch national culture, Dutch national identity, because you have this bicultural perspective, which perhaps makes you a bit more sensitive about the differences or the similarities between Dutch and Danish cultures. They are very similar, of course, but it has brought me the fascination of what is Dutch culture about? What makes Dutch people typically Dutch?
Oh, and as being Dutch myself, can you actually answer that question? Is there something typically Dutch?
Well, there is something like cultural patterns and narratives that are repeated throughout history so many times that you start identifying yourself with such narratives. So there is no such thing in reality that says this is Dutch identity and this is how you should behave. But there are many narratives, cultural patterns, stereotypes, and of course, the media has a role to play in this. They form and shape how we perceive each other in society. And some stereotypes are very, very, let's say, persistent throughout history.
Okay, so that actually reminds me of the work of, by coincidence, another Dutchman, Geert Hofstede, who is worldwide renowned for his work on the various cultures around the globe. When he was at IBM, he did an assessment how different cultures compare, and that's combining, looking at countries as a whole. On one hand, I would say it's more like on a horoscope level. You can read anything you want in your own horoscope and maybe in your culture. But what I'm hearing you say is actually it has merit because there is something you can call a particular national culture.
Yeah, well, a self-image, of course, is quite important if you want to bond a community together. And
Yeah.
this has been important in the emergence of the Dutch national state, one could say. And one of these recurrent tropes is, for instance, that they are great in managing the water.
Hmm.
So in struggling against the water, finding solutions. And this narrative is, well, centuries old, and I'm
Hmm.
fascinating in how these stereotypes, where they started and how they became so powerful that we even start believing in them. Because if you repeat them very often, then something interesting happens. Then they become get some reality aspect as
So it's a
well.
self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yeah, you could say that, but also an expert product in the case of water management.
Yeah.
It does sell also abroad that you're profiling yourself as the water experts in the world. But you see this trope centuries and centuries ago, already in the 17th century, very strong. And as a cultural historian, it's very fascinating to actually deconstruct these motives that keep on recurring throughout times.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you made a link for me between you could say a country's history and a country's culture, and also what the potential benefits could be. Because if I hear you correctly, said it's actually it becomes an export product, like the Dutch is well known for its water management. So the culture actually allows you to create or help or grow business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So cultural media, they play a role in one could say even self-fashioning,
Yeah.
a certain self-image, which may be used as an expert product as well. So the Dutch profile themselves as being the water experts in the world, and this is only a sort of a enlarging a motive that has been there all ages before.
Okay. Now, this is a nice segue to maybe explain the research you're doing, Heritage of Hunger, and how that has impact that history. Maybe if you should explain what it is, the research, and how it has an impact on today's life today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I actually have two projects going on. So the one is called Dealing with Disasters, and that's about how the Dutch dealt with disasters throughout ages. So let's say floods, earthquakes, hunger crises, explosions, fires, and so on. And the Heritages of Hunger project is actually a European project in which we investigate the way societies and certain countries have dealt with hunger crises. For instance, Ireland, but also the Netherlands, Finland, Greece, Spain. And the idea is that this is not a past crisis, but hunger crises are still relevant today. So we also ask the question, what can we learn from these crises nowadays? And one of these lessons is, for instance, that a hunger crisis is much more likely to occur again than we think. And that's with most disasters. We think, well, that's past. It's past history. We're in a very, very well organized society, at least in the Netherlands, and we feel very safe in a way. But if we look at the past, we see that crises have been there and they will be there again in the future. And then you can learn from how these past societies dealt with these crises if you want to adapt the society nowadays, make it future proof, one could say.
Okay, so does this mean you can actually mitigate risks in times of a crisis by looking at the past? Maybe develop that into policies?
Yeah, up to a certain extent, yes, you can. Of course, every past is different and is unique, but there are patterns throughout history. And well, to give just one example, you can sort of uh, how can I say that best? Well, there are certain patterns you can learn from. So,
Okay.
for instance, we had the COVID crisis recently, and what we saw was that social trust was very forceful in the beginning, solidarity, and then polarization started. And from the past, we have had many, many epidemics before. For example, the cholera crisis in the 19th century or the Spanish flu. And every epidemic learns us that if you want to keep social trust, solidarity, cohesion in a society, the measure a government takes must be proportionate, or people must feel they are legitimate, these measures. And you can predict up to a certain extent that if these crises are taking too long and are asking too much of the people, or people feel they are well, disproportionately affected by these measures, then you will get riots or real tensions in society. So that's one of the lessons you can learn from the past. Look at the crises from the past, what worked well and what didn't work. So then you can make failure paths and see what at least a government should not do in times of crisis.
Okay, but I can imagine that in times of crisis like the COVID, which we had a couple of years ago, probably the last thing a government would do is then call up an historian and say, "Hey, look, how can you help us? Because we have a burning platform, and we're not going to look at history. We have something to solve right now." So, how does that then, you could say, interact?
Yeah, I really like your question because this was actually the case when the COVID crisis happened here. We grouped together with a group of historians, Beatrice de Graaf, Rina Knoef, Katrien Santing, and we actually wrote a pamphlet stating, well, we should also have historians involved. And the way we deal with such a large crisis should be multidisciplinary. And at least in the Netherlands, it was dealt from a very strict medical perspective. And we immediately felt from the beginning, well, a pandemic is by nature also a social crisis.
Yeah.
So you need the medical experts. Of course, you need a vaccine to solve the problem, but there are social issues involved as well. And we stated in a newspaper article that we can learn from history. And we've actually, Beatrice de Graaf has developed a group called the Adapt Academy,
Mhm.
to also put forward this idea that in case of these, let's say, wicked problems in society, very complex issues such as the COVID crisis, you should involve many more disciplines than only the medical experts from the beginning. Also from, for instance, management studies, social scientists, psychologists, and so on.
Uh, you could say now that we're a little bit, COVID's behind us. I could argue, yeah, that I see your point, and I do personally believe it's valid. Did people listen to what you wrote at the time? Did people react? Did the government contact you and say, "Hey, you got a point, good, fair point"?
And we actually got lots of response because many more people felt that this needed a multidisciplinary approach. But it took some time until it actually was effective.
Okay.
It became effective after we had riots in the Netherlands. That was in January 2021. The so-called avondklokrallen in Dutch,
Yeah.
because we had a curfew in the evening,
Curfew, yes.
and then people, riots started, and then I think it became it came to the surface, these tensions in society, and it really became evident that you need more to keep societal trust, more knowledge from different sorts of disciplines to manage such a complicated crisis.
Okay. Now, you triggered also another question I have for you, because also the Dutch are well known for the fact that we like a level playing field. So
Yeah.
everybody has an opportunity to chip in, and we tend to be very vocal if we agree or disagree about something. So how does our culture compare to other cultures when it comes to setting up these multidisciplinary teams? Is it more something adaptable for a Dutch scenario compared to maybe more hierarchical society where it might be more difficult to get a multidisciplinary team in play?
That's a very complex and difficult question. But we did see that, for instance, in Germany, they had this Academie for Wissenschaften in the beginning already involved when the crisis started. And I think it was unknown territory, this COVID crisis, and we are living in a new time with different governance. It's much dependent on which political parties are in charge at the moment. But of course, there is a cultural dependency as well in what works and what doesn't work. And in all cases, I would say you need open science and a broad view. Yeah, it's the only possible response to such a question, I think. But the nice thing was there was your former question. There was actually interest from the government, so we got invitation to speak to people who were involved with some of the issues, to give our view on what can we learn from history, which parallels are there between the past and the present. And that was really fruitful to have these discussions and dialogues.
Great. I'm actually very pleased to hear that. Now, I want to go back a little bit time because we've just covered a little bit your current research and I was wondering how did you end up being a professor in literature and culture? You said you found it quite fascinating, but I'm more looking into how do you then define what topic you want to then select in doing your research in. How does that work? Because, and that question is two-part. How did you do it? And also, I saw a very long list of people you've helped in their PhD research. So from everything you could do research on, how do you select a topic?
I think that's a process along the road. You get inspired by others, of course, by your teachers, and they give you ideas about what could be interesting to teach. And of course, just as other people, I'm very much influenced by what happens in society nowadays.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I started studying Dutch identity and nationalism, let's say 15 years ago.
Mhm.
And this developed along the way. I got sub-projects or a little bit of obsessions in between, like Napoleon, who somehow gave Dutch national identity an impulse. That was not his, of course, his.
It was
He
his
didn't want
intention, I guess, but
not his intention, but it happened. And
yeah.
this Dutch national identity issue that has really fascinated me. And this can be connected, I think, to a lot of these sub-projects. So also the dealing with disasters. Because the moment a big disaster happens in society, Dutch society, there is this huge wave of solidarity. And something like Dutch national identity is being expressed, especially in the 19th century. So the 19th century is really my, let's say, my obsession. um, and so I think there are recurrent themes, but they all evolve around the same sort of main issues, like Dutch identity, the way culture shapes identity, the role of media and culture, memorial cultures, and now the disaster topic is also hugely influenced by what happens nowadays in the world.
I realize you're still doing your research. Are you able to share a couple of preliminary conclusions or observations on how a disaster is forming culture?
Yeah, well, we actually published a very nice volume with my colleagues. I will just show it.
Nice.
It is
Yeah.
entitled Dealing with Disasters from Early Modern to Modern Times, Cultural Responses to Catastrophes. And I think the main hypothesis is that culture matters also when people have to deal with huge disasters. Culture matters. And why? Because culture has several functions. And I can give you four. I will do this very briefly, don't worry. But culture helps to express your fears, for instance. So to express your grief, singing, writing, uh, ceremonials, rituals. Culture is about sharing grief, but also about giving meaning to what happens. So the minute the COVID crisis happened, people started searching for meaning as well, sense making. What
Yeah.
is happening? Why is this happening? And a third function could be that it creates solidarity. So all these charity actions are also mediated through culture. And finally, culture helps you shape a memorial culture. So how do people remember a disaster? So these are four different functions of culture. But well, the main thing is, or what we really try to stress is that we cannot make sense of what's happening around us without these cultural media. or to make it even broader, the media in general. The media, they shape our view, our perceptions. And you could even say that without this media, the disaster doesn't even exist in a way. We learn it from media 24 hours a day. And it is the first view we get on a disaster. It really shapes our mind, our perceptions.
Interesting. Okay. A little bit off topic, but you triggered me a question which about shaping your mind. I was wondering, where do you draw your inspiration from? Is that from people, from organizations, from nature?
Well, that's a very nice question. In the end, I would say from the cultural objects and literature itself. So since I've been at secondary school, I've really loved reading literature, looking at culture, and trying to understand how this is embedded in a society, the functions, and especially in a historical context. That is in the end what gives me most satisfaction. But that's the really personal involvement in science. And on a bit more societal level, it's perhaps also, one could even call it a kind of activism, that society is often only dictated by economic means. It seems like often it is forgotten what makes life more valuable. And then you come to speak of rituals, culture, meaning making. Why are we here? What are universities for? Why are we learning all this stuff? Why are we communicating this? So that's the deeper motive is then to, I think, also a way of propagating the value of the software of society. So not the hardware, not the technical hardware or the economics, but that what gives meaning to life.
You actually remind me of a quote which was attributed to Winston Churchill at the beginning of the Second World War, when the government was deciding, hey, how can we save some money? And somebody said, okay, let's just close the museums, let's close all the cultural things. And I believe that Winston Churchill then said, well, we're not going to do that because otherwise we have nothing to fight for anymore.
Oh, that's a very good quote. Yeah. And that's really what irritated me during the COVID crisis, that the first thing our government did was actually close libraries, close musea, and they stayed closed even when the shops already were allowed to open. So there was a part where I really felt this is not fair, so to speak. And the other thing that drives me, I forgot, it's quite important, is actually also a profound love for my country where I live, the Netherlands. I love the landscape, I love the language. And here comes in the Danish identity, I think. I really think the Dutch language and the culture and the landscape are worthwhile preserving and worthwhile being proud of. And
how does being Danish fit into that?
Well, because you have the perspective from abroad. So without any hesitation, I say I do love Dutch language and literature, and I think it's important to cherish it and to teach people the language and culture. And this has got new meaning in this area where, English tends to take over all education at universities. So really cherishing Dutch heritage and culture, there is something at stake there. And it's much more easy to say this as a Dane, I still have the Danish nationality, than to say it as a Dutch person, I think.
Okay, I got that. Now, in my introduction, I also mentioned you have a very, very long list of additional activities, lots of boards of advice, being on a jury. Do you recognize that observation? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now, you have an idea why you are in so many boards of advice or juries? What makes you the person that people feel, hey, we need you on this board of advice or a jury
Well,
member?
well, to start with, it's a type of expertise you can bring in, of course. So there are some literary juries amongst these, and expertise grows with years. So it's I guess um, also a matter of education in a way. I don't know. But it's also very nice to be able to be on those boards and to think, well, to decide with others which people or books or cultural objects should be awarded a prize.
And also having being on a number of boards of advice myself and a jury member, I also realized by being that you're very influential to determine what people will find relevant or important or not, because you decide that's worthwhile to look at. Do you recognize that power or that influence?
Yeah, but I don't think the words power and influence are important for me to decide whether I go on such a board or not.
Yeah.
It's really also the ambition to get these products or these things that are worthwhile being awarded put forward. And the conversations with the other jury members are always very instructive. You learn a lot from other people, and then the common sense is so interesting because literature, for instance, is a very um, dependent on different tastes. But then in the conversations, you do find out what quality is about, and there is some common ground there. And these conversations are really fruitful.
Okay. Uh, I'll briefly come back to just because I love that prize, in Dutch, the Inkspot Prize, which is a prize for the best political cartoon. I remember when it was something to laugh at, and the finalists they would hang up somewhere. But you could say handing out a prize like this is also dangerous in these times, or can be dangerous if I think about what happened with Charlie Hebdo in Paris, in France, a couple of years ago. Or am I now exaggerating?
Mm, well, it's a cartoon prize, so for the best political cartoon in the Netherlands, indeed. And I think it's of major importance that such a prize exists just because of the relevance in society and well, this liberty to be satirical or where are the borders for cartoonists? It is very, very topical issue. I don't. I'm not sure what your question was actually.
No, it's a more statement, to be honest, that I find this quite a fascinating prize. But you also made a statement which I agree with, that the fact that you're able to hand out this prize is in itself says something about the country. But I was also
Yeah,
looking at to Charlie Hebdo a couple of years ago, where being part of even something, I would say, from a Dutch perspective, it's just a political cartoon, actually can cost people their lives.
yeah. No, that's true. It's really something very worrying, of course, that it's become so controversial or sensible matter. And to get back to something you said in the beginning, it says something about Dutch culture that we're still able to give such prizes. Um, but I was aware of the fact also in the jury conversations that we are more and more aware also of what's at stake there,
Mhm.
and aware also of the risks of cartoonists, but also people involved in choosing certain cartoons. And I can only emphasize how important it is that we have a media where you can criticize society, because it's, if not, then where is the contradiction? You need controversies as well,
Yeah.
to keep your mind sharp.
Yeah.
So let's cherish these prizes like the Inkspot Prize.
Okay, so yeah, it's in that respect, it's a very serious prize to hand out because of its existence, almost. This also
Yeah.
reminds me of something I come across in my work when I talk about
But
digital
just to say one thing, sorry about that, but the self-censorship is with the cartoonists.
Yeah,
So the
okay.
jury has a very easy job. They only have to pick out the ones that are sent in. And the really difficult matters, or the let's say the dilemmas,
Yeah,
they are with the cartoonists and the newspapers and the teachers,
I got that. Yeah.
not with the jury.
And I mean, you just gave me another thought, which I linked to my work when in digital technology, and people have a discussion on, okay, how do we govern digital technology? And we used to only look at the technical aspects, and then people look at the LC aspects. They look at the ethical, legal, and societal impact of technology. And I mean, I was wondering, should we add a C to this discussion to also, or an H maybe, to look at the historical or the cultural impact, or does ethics cover that in this case?
I know that's a very fascinating suggestion, and you can predict the answer, I think. I think yes, we should, because everything you do is actually cultural embedded, and also dependent on historical context. Which context are you living in? Which political society? So historical and cultural aspects always matter, also in these issues. You asked about the cartoon jury. And the differences between cultures. I can imagine that the same goes for IA or other topics you mentioned. So this historical perspective, it's always useful, but you cannot get another answer from a historian. Then yes, you
Okay,
should.
yeah, I got that. Well, maybe then one last final question for you, Lotte, because I really loved talking to you and time is moving fast. What's your advice to young managers starting their own journey? I can predict it maybe based on our conversation. I'd like you to answer that.
That's a very nice question. Well, first of all, follow your passion and try to improve society. And how can you improve society? Always include a broader multidisciplinary perspective. And if possible, if it's applicable, make use of historical knowledge as well. Because if you know where you're coming from, then you can also better develop an idea of where you want to be heading.
Lotte Jensen, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Lotte Jensen, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I want to say tak.
Det var så lidt.
Great.
Yeah.
Hey, we'll end it right here, and hopefully we'll can continue the discussion and we're learning more about history. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.